The Atlantic Ocean was calm enough to fool anyone into believing that history always moved gently. Long before towering hotels carried the Astor name, before glittering ballrooms echoed with orchestras, before newspapers treated one family's dinner invitations as national news, there was only a young immigrant standing on the deck of a wooden ship. His clothes were simple. His future uncertain. Around him, hundreds of other passengers stared toward a coastline they barely knew, each carrying hopes too large to fit inside the small chests stacked below deck. No one watching that quiet arrival could have imagined that this young man would one day become the richest person in the United States. Even fewer could have guessed that the fortune he created would shape an entire city, define the meaning of American high society, and eventually become a symbol of how even the greatest dynasties cannot escape the passage of time. The story of the Astors is often remembered through magnificent mansions, glittering wealth, and names engraved on famous buildings. But beneath the polished marble and elegant portraits lies a far more human story. It is a story of relentless ambition, careful patience, extraordinary opportunity, and the quiet realization that no fortune, however vast, can remain untouched forever. Welcome back. If peaceful journeys through history help you unwind at the end of the day, consider staying for more by liking the video and subscribing. And if you feel like joining this little community of night travelers, tell us where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. It is always comforting to imagine people across different cities and different time zones settling into the same story beneath different skies. Now, find a comfortable place to rest. Let the day's worries drift a little farther away. Allow the room around you to grow still. Tonight, we are traveling back to the late 18th century, to a world where America itself was still young, and where one determined immigrant would begin building what became the nation's first great old money dynasty. To understand the Astors, we first have to understand the world that welcomed them. The America of the 1780s was nothing like the powerful nation we recognize today. The Revolutionary War had only recently ended. Independence had been won, but peace did not immediately bring prosperity. Roads were rough and often little more than muddy tracks connecting scattered settlements. Cities were small by modern standards. Much of the country's wealth still depended on agriculture, shipping, and trade that was vulnerable to storms, changing markets, and political uncertainty. New York itself was only beginning to discover what it might become. Today it is difficult to imagine Manhattan without endless streets, towering buildings, and millions of residents. Yet in those years the city occupied only the southern tip of the island. Beyond its crowded waterfront stretched farms, forests, rocky hills, and winding dirt paths. Cows grazed where skyscrapers would someday stand. Streams crossed fields that future generations would know as Fifth Avenue or Central Park. The skyline was made not of steel and glass but of church steeples, warehouses, chimneys, and the masts of sailing ships. The harbor, however, hinted at something larger. Every week vessels arrived carrying timber, grain, sugar, tea, cloth, tools, letters, rumors, and people. Sailors speaking English, Dutch, French, German, and countless other languages crowded the docks. Merchants negotiated prices in noisy warehouses while laborers rolled heavy barrels across wooden piers. The smell of saltwater mixed with smoke from fireplaces and fresh-cut lumber. Horses pulled wagons through narrow streets lined with brick buildings whose windows glowed softly in the evening. Opportunity seemed to drift into the harbor with every tide. Among those arriving was a young German named John Jacob Astor. He had not been born into privilege. John Jacob Astor entered the world in 1763 in the small village of Waldorf, within the Holy Roman Empire. His family worked hard as butchers. Their lives were respectable but modest. There were no family estates waiting for him. No inherited fortunes. No powerful relatives opening doors to success. Like many young Europeans of his generation, he looked beyond his homeland toward places where fortunes appeared possible. Europe during this period was changing rapidly. Population growth placed pressure on land. Traditional occupations offered limited chances for advancement. Wars had disrupted trade and reshaped borders. For ambitious young people, the promise of America became increasingly attractive. It was not necessarily a promise of comfort. Rather, it was a promise of possibility. That difference mattered. When John Jacob Astor left Europe, he carried few possessions. His greatest asset was neither money nor influence. It was his willingness to notice opportunities that others overlooked. During his journey across the Atlantic, according to later accounts, he met a fur trader who spoke at length about the profitable trade in animal pelts. Whether every detail of that conversation happened exactly as later stories described is difficult to know. But what matters is that Astor soon recognized the enormous economic value hidden within North America's forests. At first glance, the fur trade hardly sounds like the foundation of an empire. Yet in the 18th century, beaver pelts were among the world's most valuable natural resources. Fashion played a surprising role. Across Europe, beaver felt hats had become symbols of status and refinement. They were durable, elegant, and highly desirable among wealthy customers. Demand remained strong year after year. And where there is steady demand, ambitious merchants begin calculating possibilities. North America possessed immense forests filled with beavers and other fur-bearing animals. Indigenous communities had hunted and traded these animals for generations. European traders established networks that stretched across rivers, lakes, forests, and mountains. The distances involved were astonishing. Imagine canoes gliding silently through mist-covered lakes before sunrise. Picture traders carrying heavy bundles over rocky portages between rivers. Think of isolated trading posts surrounded by endless forests where winters lasted for months and supplies arrived only occasionally. The journey from wilderness trapper to fashionable European customer involved countless hands. Hunters trapped animals. Indigenous trading partners exchanged pelts for manufactured goods. Local traders gathered furs. Merchants organized transportation. Ships crossed the Atlantic. Craftsmen transformed raw pelts into finished hats. Customers in London, Paris, or Amsterdam purchased the final product, often never imagining the vast wilderness from which it had originated. John Jacob Astor saw not merely a product but an entire system. He understood that controlling more parts of that system meant greater profits. Instead of remaining satisfied as a simple middleman, he expanded steadily. He purchased furs efficiently. He cultivated relationships with suppliers. He learned markets. He watched prices carefully. He reduced unnecessary costs. Most importantly, he remained remarkably patient. Many fortunes disappear because their owners chase quick rewards. Astor often preferred slower gains that accumulated year after year. That habit would define his career. Yet history rarely rewards ambition without obstacles. Political tensions frequently interrupted trade. Wars between European powers affected shipping routes. New regulations changed markets almost overnight. Competition remained fierce. Every merchant faced uncertainty. Ships could sink. Cargoes could spoil. Prices could collapse before goods reached Europe. Letters carrying business instructions sometimes took months to arrive. In an age before telephones, railroads, or instant communication, every commercial decision carried remarkable risk. Astor learned to live with uncertainty rather than fear it. While others hesitated, he often prepared for changing circumstances before they fully arrived. This quiet adaptability became one of his greatest strengths. Meanwhile, New York continued growing around him. The city welcomed immigrants seeking work. Streets expanded northward. Small workshops became larger businesses. Churches multiplied. Newspapers circulated new ideas. Coffee houses buzzed with political debate and commercial gossip. Merchants gathered around wooden tables discussing cargoes that had not yet reached shore. Insurance brokers calculated risks. Ship captains studied weather patterns. Bankers extended credit based partly on reputation and partly on hope. Every successful transaction encouraged another. The city breathed commerce. For ordinary families, daily life remained demanding. Most homes were heated by fireplaces. Water often came from wells or public pumps. Illness spread easily. Winters could be bitterly cold. Summers brought humidity, insects, and occasional disease outbreaks. Children contributed to household labor from an early age. Women managed homes while frequently assisting family businesses. Craftsmen spent long hours producing goods by hand. Life required endurance. Against this backdrop, Astor's success did not appear magical. It appeared earned. He worked relentlessly. Accounts from those who knew him often describe a man more interested in business than display. He was careful with expenses. He preferred practical decisions over extravagant gestures. History has a habit of remembering wealthy families through luxury. But enormous fortunes are often built through habits that appear surprisingly ordinary. Keeping careful records. Negotiating patiently. Avoiding unnecessary risks. Thinking decades ahead rather than weeks ahead. These quiet routines rarely make exciting legends. Yet they often shape history more profoundly than dramatic moments. As the years passed, Astor's business expanded beyond what many competitors believed possible. The profits from fur trading accumulated into significant capital. Capital created new possibilities. And this is where the story begins to change. Because while many merchants focused entirely on their current trade, John Jacob Astor began observing something else. Something almost everyone else ignored. Land. Not farmland in distant settlements. Land in Manhattan. At the time, many regarded northern Manhattan as inconvenient countryside. Large portions remained undeveloped. Fields stretched across rolling terrain interrupted by rocky outcrops and scattered farmhouses. To many observers, purchasing large amounts of this land seemed unnecessary. Why buy empty fields when profitable commerce filled the busy waterfront? But Astor was beginning to imagine a future city that scarcely existed. He believed New York would continue growing. If the city expanded northward, today's farmland might become tomorrow's neighborhoods. The idea sounded optimistic. Perhaps even unrealistic. After all, no one could perfectly predict how rapidly America would develop. Yet the decision seemed small at the time. History would remember it very differently. Instead of spending all his wealth on luxurious living, Astor quietly invested in property. He acquired land patiently, often holding it for years without immediate profit. Many investors become restless. Astor waited. He understood something fundamental about cities. Buildings age. Businesses fail. Markets fluctuate. But well-located land, in a growing city, often becomes increasingly valuable as generations pass. It was a remarkably modern insight. Without realizing it, he was laying the foundation for one of the greatest real estate fortunes in American history. And beneath the quiet streets of early Manhattan, beneath the farms and stone walls, beneath orchards where children played and livestock wandered, the future was already taking shape. The city had not yet become the financial heart of America. The Astor fortune had not yet reached unimaginable heights. Old money, as Americans would later define it, did not yet exist. But the first stones of that foundation had already been placed. Almost no one noticed. And that, perhaps, was the greatest advantage of all. Because while the bustling docks remained filled with merchants competing for today's profits, John Jacob Astor had quietly begun investing in tomorrow. What happened next would transform not only one family's destiny, but the future skyline of New York itself. Morning arrived slowly over Manhattan, just as it always had. Before the first rays of sunlight reached the rooftops, carts already rattled across uneven streets. Bakers opened their ovens while the scent of fresh bread drifted through narrow lanes. Sailors tightened ropes along the docks, and merchants unfolded ledgers that would determine the day's fortunes. Church bells echoed through the cool morning air, mixing with the cries of gulls circling above the harbor. To most people, it was simply another ordinary day. But history often changes during ordinary mornings. While thousands of New Yorkers focused on earning enough to survive the coming week, John Jacob Astor was quietly thinking decades into the future. He was no longer merely buying and selling valuable furs. His attention had begun to settle on something far less exciting to most of his contemporaries. The ground beneath their feet. It did not sparkle like gold. It did not arrive in ships from distant oceans. It offered no dramatic stories of wilderness adventures or dangerous negotiations with foreign merchants. It simply waited. And that patience suited Astor perfectly. By the early years of the 19th century, New York was growing with remarkable speed. Every year, more immigrants stepped ashore carrying hopes that sounded surprisingly familiar. Some dreamed of opening shops. Others searched for work on the waterfront. Skilled craftsmen looked for customers, while laborers searched for wages that might allow their children to live a little more comfortably than they had. Each arrival increased the city's demand for homes, warehouses, markets, roads, and businesses. The population climbed steadily. Buildings crept farther north. Fields became neighborhoods. Country roads slowly transformed into busy streets. What had once seemed like distant farmland now stood closer to the expanding city than anyone had imagined only a generation earlier. For many landowners, this change came as a pleasant surprise. For Astor, it was the fulfillment of a long-held expectation. His investments began producing extraordinary returns. Rather than selling every valuable property immediately, he frequently leased land instead. This approach created a steady flow of income while allowing the family to retain ownership of the land itself. It was a strategy requiring patience rather than excitement. That mattered. Because fortunes earned through constant buying and selling can disappear as quickly as markets change. Fortunes tied to valuable land in a growing city often become far more difficult to lose. The Astor wealth became rooted beneath Manhattan itself. And beneath all of this, something much larger was beginning to move. America was changing. The nation stretched westward. New canals connected distant regions. Steamboats shortened journeys that had once taken weeks. Roads improved. Trade expanded. New industries appeared. Banks multiplied. Cities competed with one another to become centers of commerce. The United States was still young, but its confidence was growing. New York stood at the center of much of that transformation. Its harbor welcomed ships from Europe, the Caribbean, South America, and Asia. Warehouses overflowed with imported goods. Insurance companies, banks, and trading houses clustered close together, creating an economy whose influence reached far beyond the city's borders. Money flowed through Manhattan like the tides that entered its harbor twice each day. Astor understood that cities rarely grow by accident. Commerce attracts people. People create neighborhoods. Neighborhoods require businesses. Businesses increase land values. Higher land values attract more investment. The cycle feeds itself. He watched this process unfold almost like someone observing the changing seasons. There was little need to rush. The city itself was doing much of the work. Of course, success brought new challenges. As Astor became wealthier, expectations changed. Wealth no longer meant merely earning profits. It also meant protecting those profits. Lawyers became increasingly important. Contracts grew more complicated. Property boundaries had to be defended. Taxes required careful attention. The business of staying wealthy could sometimes become almost as demanding as becoming wealthy in the first place. Meanwhile, ordinary New Yorkers experienced the city's growth quite differently. Construction filled the streets with constant noise. Bricklayers worked from sunrise until dusk. Carpenters raised wooden frames that would soon become homes and shops. Blacksmiths hammered glowing iron into hinges, nails, and tools. Horses strained against heavy wagons carrying stone from nearby quarries. Dust settled on clothing. Mud covered boots after rain. The city smelled of smoke, animals, timber, and saltwater. Luxury remained distant for most families. Many lived in crowded boarding houses where several people shared small rooms. Disease spread easily when sanitation failed to keep pace with rapid population growth. Fires posed constant danger because many buildings stood close together and were built largely of wood. For every wealthy merchant celebrating a successful investment, countless laborers wondered whether next week's wages would be enough to feed their families. The contrast was becoming sharper. America celebrated opportunity. Yet opportunity rarely arrived equally. The Astor fortune grew during this complicated period, when remarkable prosperity existed beside remarkable hardship. History sometimes simplifies such stories into tales of heroes or villains. Reality is usually more complicated. John Jacob Astor undoubtedly possessed extraordinary vision and discipline. He recognized opportunities that others ignored. He accepted risks many would have avoided. Yet his success also depended upon living during a time when America itself was expanding rapidly. Growing cities, increasing immigration, expanding trade, and rising land values all created conditions that made fortunes on an unprecedented scale possible. Individual ambition mattered. So did historical circumstance. The two worked together. As years passed, Astor became known not simply as a successful businessman but as perhaps the richest man in the young republic. His name carried weight in financial circles. Young merchants studied his methods. Competitors watched his investments carefully. Newspapers occasionally commented on the astonishing scale of his wealth. But despite his immense fortune, Astor remained known for personal caution rather than lavish display. He was not yet creating the glittering image later generations would associate with the Astor name. That transformation belonged to his descendants. And this is where the story becomes even more fascinating. Because building wealth and living with wealth are rarely the same thing. When John Jacob Astor died in 1848, he left behind an estate valued at around $20 million, a staggering amount for the time. Much of it consisted of New York real estate whose true future value was still impossible to calculate. He could not have known just how valuable Manhattan would eventually become. Perhaps no one could. His descendants inherited not only extraordinary wealth but an extraordinary responsibility. Managing such a fortune required wisdom. It also carried temptation. The next generations no longer faced the desperate uncertainty of immigration. They did not need to wonder whether tomorrow's meal depended upon today's business decision. They had inherited security. And inherited security often changes the way families think. Children raised inside wealth experience the world differently from those who created that wealth. That is neither praise nor criticism. It is simply one of history's recurring patterns. The Astors continued investing in real estate, and as Manhattan expanded northward throughout the 19th century, their holdings increased dramatically in value. Entire neighborhoods rose upon land connected to the family. Elegant brownstones appeared where fields had once stretched beneath open skies. Gas lamps illuminated streets that had once been dark country lanes. Horse-drawn carriages rolled past rows of fashionable homes whose owners could scarcely imagine that only decades earlier cows had grazed nearby. The city kept marching north. So did the Astor fortune. For a while, it seemed as though the plan had worked perfectly. But history rarely moves in straight lines. As America entered what would later be called the Gilded Age, wealth across the country reached astonishing heights. Railroad magnates, steel industrialists, bankers, oil tycoons, and financiers accumulated fortunes that rivaled kings. Names like Vanderbilt, Carnegie, Morgan, Rockefeller, and Astor came to represent extraordinary success. Yet among these families, the Astors occupied a unique position. Unlike industrial fortunes built through factories or railroads, the Astors represented something older. Their wealth appeared rooted, stable, established. They became, in many ways, America's first true old money family. That phrase carried enormous social meaning. Old money implied more than wealth. It suggested tradition, education, manners, connections, respectability. It implied that a family belonged not merely because it possessed money, but because it had possessed money long enough for society to accept it as permanent. Whether that belief was fair is another question entirely. Many newly wealthy Americans challenged these assumptions. Some admired the Astors. Others quietly resented them. Still others competed fiercely for acceptance into the same social circles. The battle for status became almost as important as the pursuit of wealth itself. Lavish homes grew larger. Dinner parties became more elaborate. Ballrooms glittered beneath crystal chandeliers. European paintings decorated drawing rooms. Servants moved quietly through polished halls carrying silver trays and fine porcelain. The Astor residences became symbols of prestige. Visitors described richly furnished rooms filled with expensive carpets, carved wood, marble fireplaces, grand staircases, and elegant libraries. Every object communicated refinement. Or attempted to. Yet beneath these displays of confidence lay quieter human emotions. Parents worried about preserving family reputation. Children lived beneath enormous expectations. Marriages often carried social significance beyond romance. Private disagreement sometimes hid behind perfectly polite smiles. The larger the fortune became, the more complicated family life could grow. Money solved many problems. It created others. History has a habit of turning wealthy families into symbols. But inside those magnificent houses lived ordinary human beings. They celebrated birthdays. They mourned loved ones. They argued. They made mistakes. They worried about the future. They hoped their children would honor the family name. The marble walls could not prevent disappointment. The finest furniture could not remove loneliness. The greatest fortunes have never eliminated uncertainty. Outside the Astor homes, meanwhile, New York continued changing at breathtaking speed. Immigrants poured into the city from Ireland, Germany, Italy, Eastern Europe, and countless other regions. Factories expanded. Elevated railways carried passengers above crowded streets. Newspapers printed multiple editions each day to satisfy readers hungry for news. The city grew louder, busier, more ambitious, and more unequal. Some neighborhoods displayed astonishing elegance. Others struggled with overcrowding and poverty. Only a few miles could separate extraordinary privilege from desperate hardship. This contrast became one of New York's defining characteristics. The Astors stood at the very top of that social pyramid. Yet even they could not control every change unfolding around them. New fortunes challenged old ones. New ideas questioned traditional authority. New industries created billionaires whose influence sometimes exceeded that of families whose wealth had been carefully built across generations. The world that had allowed John Jacob Astor to build his empire was beginning to evolve. The foundations remained strong. But the winds above them were shifting. And before long, the Astor family would discover that preserving a dynasty could prove even more difficult than creating one in the first place. That turning point was approaching, quietly but steadily, just beyond the glittering lights of the Gilded Age. The grand ballrooms were brighter than ever. Crystal chandeliers scattered warm light across polished marble floors. Violins drifted through enormous halls while guests dressed in silk and velvet moved with practiced elegance. Servants carried silver trays between conversations about politics, business, travel, and marriage. Outside, horse-drawn carriages waited patiently beneath rows of glowing gas lamps, their wheels resting on streets that had once been quiet country roads. To anyone standing inside those magnificent rooms, the Astor Dynasty appeared unshakable. Its wealth stretched across Manhattan. Its name opened doors. Its influence shaped the highest levels of American society. It seemed impossible to imagine that such a family could ever fade. But history has a gentle way of reminding us that permanence is often an illusion. The forces that transform empires do not always arrive with armies. Sometimes they arrive through technology, changing values, economic shifts, and the quiet passage of generations. The Astors would experience all of them. By the closing years of the 19th century, America had become one of the world's great industrial powers. Railroads crossed the continent. Electric lights replaced gas lamps. Telephones connected offices that had once depended entirely upon handwritten letters. Skyscrapers began climbing above the streets of New York, changing the skyline almost year by year. The city John Jacob Astor had first known would have been almost unrecognizable. The farms had disappeared. The forests were gone. The quiet roads had become avenues crowded with traffic and commerce. His vision had proved remarkably accurate. Yet success brought new challenges. The Astor family had become not only wealthy but famous. Newspapers reported their weddings, charitable donations, vacations, and disagreements. Society pages followed their invitations almost as closely as political developments. Private lives became public entertainment. That attention created its own pressure. Every family disagreement risked becoming gossip. Every marriage carried social consequences. Every inheritance attracted public curiosity. The dynasty was no longer merely living history. It had become a spectacle. One of the most influential figures of this period was Caroline Astor, often remembered simply as the Mrs. Astor. She became the unofficial leader of New York's highest social circles during the Gilded Age. Invitations to her gatherings carried enormous significance. Acceptance meant prestige. Exclusion could feel like social exile. Alongside the influential social organizer Ward McAllister, she became associated with the famous idea of the 400, a list said to represent the people considered truly acceptable within elite New York society. Whether the list was ever as fixed or official as later stories suggested remains debated by historians. Yet the idea itself became powerful. It reflected a society increasingly concerned not merely with wealth but with belonging. Money alone was no longer enough. Families competed for recognition, refinement, and reputation. The Astors stood near the very center of that world. But beneath the polished surface, America itself was changing. Millions of immigrants continued arriving. Factories expanded. Labor movements demanded better working conditions. Journalists exposed political corruption. Universities grew. Scientific discoveries reshaped daily life. The country was becoming larger, faster, and more diverse. Old social rules began to loosen. New fortunes challenged old traditions. Families whose wealth came from railroads, steel, banking, and oil often possessed fortunes that rivaled, or even exceeded, the Astors. The balance of influence slowly shifted. No single family could define American society forever. And then came one of the most memorable nights in the history of the dynasty. It began with confidence. It ended in silence. In April 1912, John Jacob Astor IV boarded the RMS Titanic with his young wife, Madeline. The ship itself represented extraordinary optimism. Engineers had created one of the largest passenger liners ever built. Newspapers celebrated its luxury. Travelers admired its elegant dining rooms, grand staircases, Turkish baths, libraries, and comfortable cabins. Many believed it represented the triumph of modern engineering. Technology seemed capable of conquering almost anything. The Atlantic appeared calm. The future looked bright. History would remember it differently. When the Titanic struck an iceberg on the night of April 14, the disaster unfolded slowly enough that many passengers struggled to understand the danger. Some continued talking in lounges. Others hesitated to leave warm cabins. Musicians continued playing as confusion spread across the decks. John Jacob Astor IV reportedly helped his pregnant wife into a lifeboat before asking whether he might accompany her. He was refused because the policy favored women and children. He accepted the decision calmly. His wife survived. He did not. Days later, rescue ships recovered many victims from the freezing Atlantic. Among them was one of the richest men in America. His death shocked the nation. It also carried symbolic weight. If someone as wealthy and influential as an Astor could disappear beneath the sea, then perhaps modern progress itself was not as certain as people had imagined. The Titanic became more than a maritime disaster. It became a reminder of human vulnerability. The Astor name remained. But one of its most famous figures had been lost. For the family, the tragedy was deeply personal. For America, it became part of a larger story about ambition, confidence, and the limits of technology. Yet even this heartbreaking event was not the end of the dynasty's challenges. The decades that followed transformed the United States more rapidly than almost anyone could have predicted. The First World War reshaped international politics. The 1920s brought economic expansion, jazz, automobiles, radios, and changing social expectations. Then came the Great Depression. Financial markets collapsed. Businesses failed. Banks closed. Millions lost their jobs. Even families possessing enormous wealth felt the changing climate. Real estate values fluctuated. Taxes increased. Large private mansions became increasingly expensive to maintain. The economics that had once favored vast family estates began to change. Some grand houses were sold. Others were demolished. Still others became museums, schools, offices, or apartment buildings. The physical landscape of old money America slowly evolved. The Astors adapted where they could. Some family members pursued business. Others entered public service. Some devoted themselves to philanthropy, supporting libraries, hospitals, educational institutions, and cultural organizations. The family name remained respected. But it no longer carried the overwhelming influence it once had. That is one of history's quieter lessons. Decline does not always arrive through dramatic collapse. Sometimes it arrives gradually. Generation by generation. Decision by decision. Tax by tax. Inheritance by inheritance. Until one day people realize that an age has ended. The America that produced the first Astor fortune had been a nation of expanding frontiers and rapidly increasing land values. The America of the mid-20th century operated according to different rules. Corporations grew larger than family businesses. Professional managers replaced patriarchs. Stock markets expanded. Technology companies emerged. New industries created new billionaires. Old money no longer stood alone at the summit of American wealth. Yet the Astor legacy did not disappear. Walk through parts of Manhattan today, and you are still moving across neighborhoods shaped by decisions made more than 2 centuries ago. Look at maps of New York, and you can still trace the astonishing foresight of John Jacob Astor's real estate investments. Visit libraries supported by Astor Philanthropy. Read about the Astor Hotel. Explore the history of New York society. Study the Titanic. Again and again, the family appears. Not because they remained the richest forever, but because they helped shape the America that followed. Perhaps that is the true measure of a historical legacy. Not endless wealth, but lasting influence. History has a habit of flattening great families into simple symbols. The Astors are often remembered only as unimaginably rich. The reality was more complicated. The dynasty began with an immigrant who possessed little more than determination and careful judgment. It expanded through patience rather than reckless speculation. It flourished because one man recognized the future value of a growing city before most of his contemporaries did. Its later generations experienced extraordinary privilege. They also faced expectations few families could fully escape. Some members achieved remarkable success. Others struggled beneath the weight of an extraordinary family name. Like every dynasty, they contained ambition and generosity, wisdom and mistakes, confidence and uncertainty. They were never simply a fortune. They were people. And perhaps that is what makes their story worth returning to. Because behind every famous building stands someone who once made an uncertain decision. Behind every family portrait stood individuals who could not see the future any more clearly than we can today. John Jacob Astor could not have known exactly what Manhattan would become. His descendants could not have predicted the Titanic. The wealthy families of the Gilded Age could not foresee the Great Depression. History always keeps part of tomorrow hidden. That hidden future is what makes every age feel permanent while it lasts. Only later do people realize they were living through the end of one world and the beginning of another. The Astor Dynasty reminds us that fortunes can be built through patience, discipline, and remarkable vision. It also reminds us that wealth alone cannot freeze time. Cities change. Societies evolve. New generations create different priorities. Even the grandest names slowly become chapters in history books rather than headlines in newspapers. And perhaps there is something strangely comforting about that. It reminds us that history belongs not only to kings, presidents, and millionaires, but also to dockworkers unloading ships before dawn, immigrants stepping onto unfamiliar shores, carpenters raising homes on empty streets, clerks balancing account books by candlelight, and families quietly hoping that tomorrow might be just a little better than today. Those ordinary lives formed the foundation upon which extraordinary fortunes were built. Without them, there could have been no Astor Dynasty. As the lights of old New York fade into memory, the city itself continues to breathe above the foundations laid centuries ago. Beneath modern skyscrapers, beneath crowded sidewalks and glowing windows, echoes remain of fields, orchards, warehouses, and quiet investments that changed the course of American history. If you are still awake, thank you for spending this quiet journey through the rise and fall of America's first great old money family. I hope these stories have brought a little calm, a little wonder, and perhaps a new way of looking at the streets and skylines that surround us today. For now, let the city grow quiet once more. Let the harbor rest beneath the night sky. Let the voices of merchants, immigrants, builders, and dreamers fade gently into the distance. There will always be another forgotten road through history waiting for us. But tonight, allow this one to settle softly into memory, and let the night carry you peacefully toward sleep.